Up to this point, we have been examining the approach within linguistics that centers on the structure of language. We now turn to the other tradition within linguistics, which centers its attention around the function that language fulfills in human life. The first thing that comes to mind when we think of the function of language is that it fulfills our need for communication. We can now examine how this fundamental function of language might be determining the way language is built. So imagine I'm currently located in Groningen. If so, both a sentence like Matt goes to Amsterdam today or one like Nina comes to Groningen today sound perfectly fine, in a way that a sentence like Matt comes to Amsterdam today does not at all, and one like Nina goes to Groningen today, although a bit better than the former one, still does not sound as good either. So why should this be so? Well, it seems that when they speak, speakers mark their perspective linguistically. This is why if I'm in Groningen, I will perceive of someone moving towards Groningen as coming, while if someone moving away from Groningen, say to Amsterdam, as going, and I will prefer this framing of otherwise neutral movement over any other, and hence will choose my words accordingly, all the way signaling to my speaker where I am located with respect to other entities moving through space. So the first property that we can observe in language which is related to communication is that language is speaker-oriented. A very poignant example of this perspective-taking property of language is the pronominal system. If you think about it, the meaning of the pronoun I is simply the one speaking, while you means the one who is spoken to. This is again an example of language being speaker-centered. We are so used to this rather salient feature of language that we don't realize that it is just one of the logical possibilities. In fact, children have difficulty understanding this perspective-taking system in a way similar to the clip I've included in the slide regarding Tarzan, the boy who grew up in the jungle as the lone survivor in Burroughs' novel.
Thank you.
Indeed, speakers subtly communicate their perspective on the facts they are talking about in a way that is certainly clearly understood by the interlocutor. Sometimes they do so by carefully choosing the words they use. For example, take the sentence, Ruth said that the novel was terrible, and compare it with Ruth admitted that the novel was terrible. What's the difference between the two portrayals of the same situation? In both, the speaker is seemingly just reporting on Ruth's opinion about the novel, right? Well, this is certainly so. In the second sentence, the speaker is in addition revealing his or her personal opinion about the novel by using admit instead of the truth-neutral said. Another example. Think of the pair of sentences. Have you stopped exercising regularly? And have you tried exercising regularly? What does the speaker presuppose about the exercise habits of the listener in each case? Please pause the video in order to think about it for a moment. You probably guessed that in 3, the speaker assumes that the hearer was exercising, while in 4, that the hearer wasn't. This very subtle but clear submessage is effectively communicated by choosing stop versus try in an otherwise identical question. This is what we mean when we say that speakers signal their beliefs through their choice of words. So we have seen how speakers subtly but clearly mark their point of view by choosing their words and by taking advantage of built-in perspective-taking systems in language, such as the pronominal system. One more way speakers can make clear where they are talking from is manipulating the sound properties of their utterances. Please take a moment to observe the following data. Imagine my young daughter, Mary, had a soccer match this morning, but I couldn't go because I was preparing these videos, so my husband brought her. Before they get back home, I learned from Facebook that something bad happened on the game. When they come back, I ask him, What happened at the game? Now this is an open question, but my husband is likely to understand that I heard that something out of the ordinary happened, and is likely to give me the relevant information. I will suddenly become very impatient very quickly if he starts telling me that all kids were wearing blue t-shirts, or whether Toby's father was also at the game, or whether they had a snack during halftime, all things that might have happened at the game, but that are somehow rightly understood to be secondary to my inquiry. Now consider two possibilities for my husband's answer. The first one, he says, Mary fell. The second one, he says, Mary fell. What is the difference between the two? Please pause the video in order to think about it yourself. In the first sentence, Mary fell, the speaker seems to assume that I heard about a kid falling, but I am missing the information of which kid did it. That is, someone falling is the information we both share, and the fact that it was Mary who fell is new to me. English marks new information with a special intonation. This is clear from the second sentence, Mary fell, where he's assuming I heard that something happened to Mary, but I don't know what. That she fell is new to me, and he marks it with that special emphatic intonation as new information for me. We can see this even more clearly if we make the question more explicit as for what I don't know or I know regarding the event. If my question is, what happened to Mary? Meaning, I know something happened to her, but I don't know what, I'm asking my husband for new information about my daughter. Mary is the old information, and whatever happened to her will be the new to me. Consistently, he can answer, Mary fell, because English marks new information with an emphatic intonation, here symbolized by the capital letters. But it is weird if he answers, Mary fell. This intonation pattern in English means that Mary is new information, that I knew about someone falling, and Mary is the one who did it. But remember that this was not the case. I'm asking what happened to Mary. He can only say, Mary fell. Falling is what happened to her, and this is new information for me. On the other hand, if I ask, who fell? It is clear that the fact that someone fell is known to me, but I'm asking him to give me the new information about who fell. Since, once more, English marks new information with an emphatic intonation, his answer can only be Mary fell, and not Mary fell. Now let's back up for a moment. I told you speakers and hearers of English codify new versus old information in their conversations. But the surprising thing that my husband did here is that he was able to manipulate his language to reflect what was old and new information for me, not for him. We said before that language was speaker-oriented. Remember the pronominal system and the use of coming and going, Tarzan. Here we have an example of how speakers can, in other occasions, take the perspective of the listener. It is not uncommon in English and in many other languages to answer the question, are you coming? With a clear speaker-oriented choice, with I'm coming, which clearly takes the perspective of the listener. In some, the organization of information in terms of it being old or new is something language codifies. What is especially interesting is that it does so in a way that clearly indicates that language can be listener-oriented. We have just seen how speakers use intonation in order to communicate more effectively the beliefs about what they themselves and their interlocutors know and believe, to create specific meanings that mark their respective perspectives on the information communicated in conversation. But intonation is not the only way language is used to make clear what the relevant new information is in a given conversation. Other languages use the manipulation of their structure to codify that same meaning. Indeed, what English marks with intonation, Spanish codifies by word order. In Spanish, to the question, ¿Qué ha pasado? What happened? There are two possible answers. María tropezó or tropezó María, both meaning Mary tripped, but the first one having the subject before the verb and the second the subject after the verb. In Spanish, there is no doubt that in terms of subject-verb ordering, the one that goes first is old information, while the second is new. This is parallel to in English, having the one with the emphatic intonation being the new information. Pragmatics is the discipline within linguistics that deals with this contextual form of meaning. The purpose of these observations is to give you an example of how, to the extent that speakers are able to model their speech taking into account their listeners' knowledge, the communicative function can be said to shape the structure of language. And that means that in human language, the ability to sustain beliefs about the beliefs of the listener is an essential structural component. This is an example of that intricate relationship between structure and function that we were mentioning before. In addition to reflecting what they think about their listeners' relationship to the information they are conveying, speakers also codify a lot of information about themselves through language. In the United States, for example, one can more or less unconsciously give away one's geographical origin just by asking the quintessential grocery question, "Do you want this in a bag?" Or may I say, "Do you want this in a sack?" Since the same object receives different labels according to geographical dialect. And the same for sets like soda, pop, also within the United States, or truck, lorry, and truckie, when we include the US, the UK, and Australia. What is interesting is that this is not something restricted to some peripheral words that a speaker might never encounter. Not all of us spend time talking about trucks. Some very basic grammatical elements also give away our origin, as in the case of the second-person plural pronoun, which takes a number of shapes across dialects of English. And it is not only words. Syntax also codifies our origin, real or constructed. If I utter the sentence, "You don't know nothing 'cause you was not there," I am clearly identifying myself as belonging to a certain group of people. Once we have established the connection between a way of speaking and some group or personal characteristics, we can use the way a certain group speaks to dump all of our prejudices about such group, all the way pretending that we're only talking about their language. Please pause the video in order to take a closer look at the following real advertisement. So people have feelings and beliefs about non-linguistic characteristics associated with ways of speaking. Sometimes about a whole language, like when we think that Spanish is easier than German, but more fun, because of our prejudices about the general intelligence and fun potential of the people who speak these languages. Those beliefs is what we call language or linguistic attitudes. In sum, language variation is therefore a fundamental property of language, and it cannot be otherwise if it is to reflect the marvelous diversity of human groups. And sociolinguistics is the discipline within linguistics that studies the extent to which language reflects the social and personal characteristics of its users. Now, everything we said up to here seems to assume that we are paying a lot of attention to the way we, as well as others, speak. But perhaps it is an exaggeration to say that speakers pay attention to their listeners. After all, it has been said that in conversation, and this is most obvious in a date situation, we are more worried about what we are going to say next, or sometimes, like in a date, in keeping the conversation flowing, than about what our interlocutor is saying. In a date, we are not listening to the word choice, intonation patterns, and syntactic structure of our date as much as we are paying attention to other things. And nevertheless, dates are successful, sometimes at least. So while we may be paying at least some attention to our interlocutors, it seems plausible to think that the main function of language goes beyond communication. A very interesting idea is that beyond communication, the main function of language is that of forming a coherent representation of our chaotic world. Stimuli from the world comes to us in a totally unstructured fashion, and we need to categorize it in a way that determines our behavior. For example, if I see an object approaching me from the front at a certain speed, I need to quickly decide whether to think of it as something in the category of things I should be running from, a lion, a truck, or a hatred family member, or in the category of things I would be happy to encounter, a pleasant sea wave, a friend, or my dog. Now, while we use many cognitive abilities to put things into categories, and non-linguistic beings such as pigeons, rats, and dogs do it, we humans use language to take some shortcuts. How else could we inform our children that dolphins and whales are not fish when they look the lot? Or that both a Great Dane and a Chihuahua are actually dogs, instead of one being in the category of small ponies and the other of rats? In any case, as a final note, please use the internet to find out what Gavagai refers to. See if you make sense of why I included a reference to it in this slide. So, I hope to have made clear that both when we talk about the structure of language and its function, everybody agrees that in order to define language, we cannot take it as a whole. We need to consider language's different components separately. First, language is composed of sounds, or gestures in the case of sign languages, since we need to use a physical medium to produce language. This is of course dependent on the structure of our articulatory and perceptive systems, since we will only be producing those sounds that are possibly pronounced given our physical limitations, and only those that can be clearly discerned by our perception. On the other hand, those sounds or gestures will have to encode a meaning, which obviously reflects the structure of our conceptual and intentional systems. Now, while the concrete pairing between a given sound or string of sounds and a given meaning is arbitrary, there are many structural principles that govern how we relate sounds with meanings, words or sentences with what we want to say. Phonology, morphology, and syntax are the subfields of linguistics that are set to find out those structural principles. In this fashion, by first examining the different components of language separately and then trying to find out how they relate to each other, we can start to have a clearer picture of what our object of study is like. Obviously, language is at least in part a learned behavior. A very important question to ask is, how do we learn language? Which is to say, how do we learn this rule-governed system? This is not a trivial task, since when we are exposed to language, we only get the tip of the iceberg of a given structure. Indeed, the underlying logic of a, say, syntactic rule system is not immediately given on the surface of the utterance that it determines, but must somehow be inferred. Not a trivial task. Ask a linguist who has dedicated her whole career to find out the distribution of a sound or the relationship between an active and a passive sentence. So if we only get the tip of the iceberg, how come we all end up with knowledge of the whole structure? Because the fact is that every child learns its native language over the first year of life, when other seemingly simpler analytic tasks, such as simple arithmetics or tying their shoes, are well beyond its reach. And they do so without special guidance or reinforcement, with poverty of the stimulus, within a critical period, on schedule, and dissociated from general intelligence. The next slides, I think, are self-contained, so I'll let you read them. They contain a mini segment on what we know about the acquisition of language. Since this is not the focus of our course, I will just let you read them on your own. I will be returning in the final slide though, so stay tuned. So here's a summary of what we have learned about linguistics. Linguistics concerns itself with the fundamental questions of what language is and how it is related to other human faculties. In answering these questions, linguists consider language as a cultural, social, and psychological phenomenon and seek to determine what is unique in languages, what is universal, how language is acquired, and how it changes. Linguistics is, therefore, one of the cognitive sciences. It provides a link between the humanities and the social sciences, as well as education and hearing and speech sciences. So again, in this course, we will concern ourselves with the anatomy of language. The following presentations will be introducing you to the basic concepts and methodologies of the so-called grammatical disciplines: phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics.